You've been told that China is the next global superpower, an unstoppable economic juggernaut destined to overtake the West. Yet, right now, all across China, tens of millions of empty apartments sit behind sealed gates. Unfinished residential buildings gather dust. A property system that used to power the entire country's economy is grinding to a halt. The life savings of an entire generation has been wiped out, with the Chinese middle class losing up to $20 trillion in household wealth. That's more than the entire GDP of China itself. This isn't a recession, it's a silent financial nuclear winter. It doesn't just affect this generation, but the generations to come. In China, real estate isn't just about having a place to call home. For many families, properties are vaults, their retirement accounts, their investments, their life savings, pensions, and future stability, all wrapped up in bricks and mortar, which is why the Chinese people are so willing and eager to invest almost all of their money in them. Reuters reports that around 70% of all of China's household wealth sits in property, which is significantly higher than the US, where the same metric sits at just 35%. In other words, the average Chinese family has almost 3/4 of its entire life savings locked into concrete, and that concrete is rapidly losing value. There's just far too much of it to go around. Conservative estimates suggest the country has at least 65 million vacant homes. Other estimates are significantly higher. Some sources state that China has up to 100 million either empty or unfurnished apartments. 100 million apartments would be enough to house the entire populations of both France and the United Kingdom combined. It is enough raw vacant space for almost up to 300 million people. One official even said that China's mammoth population of 1.4 billion wouldn't be enough to fill the countless properties that are sitting around going to no use. For generations, Chinese families, particularly those among the middle class, were trained to believe that buying property was the best possible decision they could make. While citizens in other countries, like the US for example, tend to diversify their net worth across a variety of assets, from real estate to bonds to equities and shares, the Chinese system has always been different. For a long time, it worked, and it made sense. It gave people the stability and the returns on their investments that they'd hoped for. But when so much of your money is tied up in a single structure, even the slightest fluctuation in the value matters more than normally. It doesn't just affect those at the top of the food chain, like developers, investors, and speculators. Instead, it spreads across the population, impacting the spending power of ordinary families. It suppresses their ability to buy, it limits their capacity to consume, and it freezes the entire economy from the inside out. When home prices fall, millions of families suffer the effects as they watch their largest, most important store of value break beneath the weight. This is why the collapse matters so much. Because China didn't just build vast cities and thousands of towering apartment buildings, it built an entire financial system around one core assumption: that property prices would never meaningfully fall. The demand would always be there, even if it had to be manufactured somehow. Households could rest assured that putting their money into real estate and treating homes like savings accounts was both the easiest and smartest financial move they could make. Now those same families are being forced to watch their wealth crumble around them. They're seeing their savings erode before their eyes, their net household wealth beginning to wither and wilt. When people feel poor, they inevitably spend less. When they spend less, the economy slows down. When the economy slows down, the property market gets even weaker. It's a vicious cycle, but the worst part of all is that this wasn't a mere accident or unfortunate turn of events. What looks on the surface like a housing crisis is actually something significantly darker. It's a system propped up with lies and empty promises, a model that turned homes into financial revenue and middle-class money into the fuel that kept the machine turning over. So while those tens of millions of houses remain without life or purpose, the wealth that helped to build them is rapidly fading away. But how did an entire nation get tricked into buying millions of empty boxes? It's easy. They were lied to. For decades, the general public was told a story built on the premise of scarcity. The ruling classes of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, warned them that land was scarce, that urban space was finite, that the continuous migration of rural citizens into big cities and metropolitan centers meant that property values were destined to rise. And over time, people were conditioned into one unavoidable conclusion: buy now or be locked out forever. Apartments stopped feeling like luxury purchases or even just places to live. They became survival assets. It was the one and only way to safeguard their families' futures, to prevent them from being left behind. The CCP propped up this narrative in various ways, including the aggressive promotion of a national strategy to increase urbanization. To be more precise, in its 14th five-year plan, which ran from 2021 to 2025, the state set out a specific 65% urbanization target. It wanted to have around two-thirds of the country's population living in the cities by 2025. It had already undergone unprecedented urban transformation in the previous years. The country's overall urbanization rate rose from a mere 36% in 2000 to over 60% by 2019. That's the equivalent of almost 400 million more people living in urban centers, more than the entire population of the United States. This influx of rural residents into the metropolitan spaces has proven to be a huge boon for the economy, so it's no surprise then that those in charge would want to see ever-increasing urbanization. Throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s, countless state sources stressed the importance of that 65% target. State media agencies, academic institutions, and corporate developers all helped to build the narrative that hundreds of millions more rural workers were set to flood into the urban pipeline. There would be an endless and insatiable level of demand for metropolitan real estate. It was the perfect psychological trap. Build just the right amount of panic and doubt in people's minds so that everyone decided to buy up apartments at hyperinflated prices. But here's the thing, the entire story was based on ideas that were out of date. For decades, China's overall population increased and the country's urbanization program worked. Millions left the countryside communities behind in favor of a better life in the big city. But in the 2020s, that all changed. A new reality set in, one in which China's population is both shrinking and aging at a rapid rate. Data shows that the population effectively stagnated in 2021 and began to decline every year after. That demographic shift is important. Property markets are dependent on new buyers. They need those young couples and fresh-faced families eager to take their first steps on the property ladder. But when your population is actively shrinking and forecasts suggest that this is a long-term trend, that demand that powers the market has weakened. And it's at the same time as excess housing is being built. The powers that be knew all of this, but they had to keep the people's faith in the system alive. To do that, they had to perpetuate the scarcity myth. If families believed that homes were in short supply, they would happily buy them up at a higher and higher rate. It wouldn't matter to them because they were confident they'd end up in profit. But if the demand was never actually there, why were so many of these cities and skyscrapers constructed to begin with? Enter the local governments. China's local governments weren't passive spectators or innocent bystanders in the country's property boom. They were active participants in it. In fact, on some level, they almost became addicted to it. They fanned the flames and encouraged people and investors to buy up more and more homes. Why? Because at least some of the money from local land sales flows right into these governments' coffers. They needed it to keep pouring in by any means necessary. In 1994, China introduced a fiscal reform. This represented a massive overhaul in the way the country handled taxes. It introduced a new tax-sharing system designed to re-centralize revenue collection, which had fallen to worryingly low levels in the preceding years. In other words, it was designed to increase the share of tax revenue that went straight to the central government. The reform introduced a new national tax service, as well as a value-added tax or a VAT system. All taxes were classified into three distinct categories: central, local, and shared. This led to a quite dramatic imbalance in the country's economy, where the central government grew richer while local governments grew poorer. They were left with huge fiscal responsibilities, like having to fund local healthcare, maintain infrastructure, pay public servants' salaries, and provide education, but with less money to fulfill them. So these local governments did the only thing they could do. They looked for other sources of revenue, and they soon realized that land sales were one of the most effective options available to them. It wasn't that the governments were necessarily intending to be underhanded or malicious. They were simply doing what they had to do to survive. Eventually, they became dependent on land sales to stay afloat. Statistics show that between 2000 and 2017, land revenue represented over 50% of all local government fiscal revenue. That's not some sort of side revenue stream. It is a fiscal dependency. If the governments failed to sell off sufficient amounts of real estate, they simply wouldn't have enough money to keep operating. And if that happened, their infrastructure would crumble, their services would weaken, and the populations would likely leave en masse. Their fragile economies would be damaged even further. But what started as a battle for survival soon devolved into a quest to make as much money as they possibly could. It wasn't just about raising enough revenue to make ends meet anymore. These governments wanted to squeeze as many yuan as they could out of every single square foot of land. They effectively began to weaponize land sales, turning the real estate market into their personal fiscal engines. They were less focused on civic duties and more on marketing and enabling the ever-expanding property bubble. Every bit of land they could sell meant more money flowing into their accounts to help counteract their growing deficits. But the problem with this approach is that it meant the local budgets became intrinsically linked to land values. If those values ever fell, local governments would be hit the hardest. But who was actually buying up all that land and property, and how were they hiding the debt? In the years following the 1994 fiscal reform, local governments became more and more dependent on land and real estate sales for vital revenue. But that led to the development of a whole new dilemma. In a system with direct borrowing limits, how could the machine keep on moving? How could these authorities keep on borrowing money to fund the development of new properties and construction projects? To any outside observer, it seemed inevitable that the debt limits would eventually be hit. At that point, it would become impossible for local governments to borrow the money they needed to keep the wheels turning. Somehow, however, they found a way to work around this issue. It came in the form of something called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs. In a nutshell, LGFVs are state-backed companies that allow local governments to borrow enormous amounts of money without officially putting the debt on their own books. They've even been called the black holes of the Chinese financial system by financial experts. And just as the local governments came to rely on land sales, they also became increasingly dependent on these financing vehicles, to quite a staggering degree. At one point, reports revealed that the total amount of shadow debt accumulated via LFGVs was a staggering 9 trillion. In real terms, that meant that around half of China's total GDP was hidden away in these off-balance sheet entities. And much of that money went straight into real estate development projects along with other infrastructure. It was all aimed at making these regions more attractive to prospective investors, business owners, and future residents. With an almost infinite pool of leverage to pull from through their shadow debt machines, local governments started building anything they could think of, even if it didn't necessarily make sense. High-speed rail lines to nowhere in particular, grand squares and plazas despite a lack of anything of importance around them, and of course, large amounts of residential real estate as well. Many people have a misconception about China's so-called ghost cities. Analysts see pictures of these vast empty spaces and they assume they're the result of bad planning or bureaucratic incompetence. They say that the local authorities must have been overly optimistic about their development or rushed into new projects without thinking them through. In short, they think that all those empty buildings are unfortunate accidents or unintended side effects of excess ambition. They're wrong. These ghost cities aren't there by accident. They are not planning errors. They are debt extraction zones. They were built not because there was a demand for them, but because the actual act of building them helped convert land into cash, and this in turn allowed the authorities to get deeper into debt, which then paved the way for even more development. It was not a healthy system in any sense, but it was a functioning one. These empty homes were never intended to house human beings. Their true purpose was to extract wealth from the middle classes and convert it into funding to keep state operations going. The concrete towers were merely the collateral, and thanks to them, the local governments were saved. But this created a bubble so massive it defied global economic laws. At its peak, the scale of China's real estate universe became almost impossible to comprehend. It shattered records and smashed standards, defying logic and reason to become far greater than anything the world had ever seen before. Estimates varied from source to source, but it was broadly accepted that the country's real estate market eventually reached a total value of over $60 trillion. That's more than the United States residential market, and it's 4 times China's GDP. In fact, it's the equivalent of the combined GDPs of several of the world's wealthiest nations, including China, the US, Japan, Germany, and India. It is an astronomical amount of money, all tied up in bricks and mortar and cement. At that point, it had effectively become the biggest financial anomaly in modern history, and it didn't follow the usual patterns and rules one would expect. It worked more like a classic pyramid scheme than a conventional real estate industry. The bottom layer of that pyramid, the part propping up everything else, was the pre-sale model. As the name suggests, this involves buyers paying for properties before they actually existed. In most other countries around the world, it doesn't work that way. In the US, buyers might put down a deposit on a home that's under construction, which could be as low as 10 or even 5% of the final purchase price. It's a way to lock in the sale and prove your commitment to the property, but you wouldn't be expected to pay the property's full price at once, especially before it's even finished. The Chinese model, however, demands that buyers pay 100% of the sales price up front before ground has even been broken. To do this, citizens would often have to take out huge mortgages. They would gamble everything on buildings that were little more than blueprints. They would hand over their entire life savings to developers, hoping and praying that they held up their end of the deal. What was supposed to happen next is that those pre-sale funds would be locked away in escrow accounts until the homes were built. They had to meet the original specifications and the buyer's expectations, thereby avoiding any disputes. What often happened instead was that developers used the money to buy even more land from local governments, usually at wildly inflated prices, feeding the cycle all over again. To those developers and investors, this was the logical thing to do. There was no point in delaying purchases and paying more in the long run. The more land they bought today, the more money they'd be able to make tomorrow. It was perhaps the biggest pyramid scheme ever seen. It was entirely reliant on new buyers coming in at the bottom layer to keep the funds flowing in. That was the only way the older projects would ever get finished, and new ones would continue being funded. As soon as the influx of retail buyers slowed down, even slightly, the entire pyramid could come crumbling down. And that is exactly what happened, because a $65 trillion bubble built on pre-sales can't last forever. Someone had to pull the plug. In 2020, the CCP pushed the kill switch on the property pyramid scheme. Regulators introduced the so-called 3 red lines policy. It was essentially a set of debt restrictions designed to stop property developers from endlessly piling on more and more leverage. Developers were made to meet 3 specific criteria regarding their debt ratios. If they violated all 3 rules, they would be barred from taking on any further debt. Even violating 1 or 2 of the lines resulted in punishment, albeit slightly less severe. As a direct result of this kill switch tactic, even the biggest development firms were forced to deleverage, which led to a massive liquidity crisis. This also resulted in many outside observers and analysts misunderstanding the whole point of the policy. Indeed, many news agencies, particularly in the West, framed the 3 red lines as some sort of mistake. They argued that Beijing's regulators had misjudged the market's fragility or even made some sort of bureaucratic error, resulting in major developers defaulting. Yet, as disastrous as it seems, this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight or a misjudgment, but a calculated reset from those in the highest positions of power. Beijing looked at the state of the developer sector, and it saw the insane levels of debt that were spiraling out of control. It saw the growing addiction among local governments to their shadow debt machine, and the ever-expanding array of pointless projects and empty buildings. And it decided to blow it all up. Not literally, but figuratively. A controlled bursting of the bubble, a forced demolition of a system that had been allowed to rot for far too long. Because if that system was allowed to continue and the developers continued to borrow more and more money, the effects would begin to hit the broader state-owned banking system, the very system that fueled the CCP's regime. It was a move of self-preservation. It was the party's way to regain control of a deteriorating situation and eliminate a growing threat to its own existence. And when it cut off the institutional credit lines that had fueled indebted property developers for decades, the central government knew what would come next. It anticipated the insolvencies and the liquidity crisis that would consume the construction sector. It knew, too, that countless people who had poured their savings into these properties would also pay a price, that all of their hopes and dreams of a safe, stable financial future were about to go up in smoke. But it accepted those eventualities as acceptable byproducts. They were unfortunate but unavoidable consequences. It was a strategic trade-off. The CCP willingly chose to sacrifice the wealth, the stability, and the future of the entire middle class in order to protect its financial systems and its political control. People were just crumple zones in the state's head-on collision with the development sector. It may have saved itself, but the citizens were left holding the bag. The structural fallout from the CCP's kill switch decision was immediate, brutal, and historic. Once the liquidity they'd been relying on to operate dried up, dozens of China's development firms began to fold. Since 2021, over 50 Chinese developers have defaulted on offshore bonds, totaling a whopping $100 billion in overall defaults. That's a default wave even larger than the 2008 United States subprime crisis in terms of pure developer insolvency. And these weren't just little companies or no-name players in the development sector, they were some of the biggest and most successful businesses. Businesses like Evergrande, for example. Founded in 1996, it worked its way up to become the second largest property developer by sales in all of China in 2017. A year later, it was officially classed as the most valuable real estate company in the world. Focused primarily on selling apartments to upper and middle income earners, it seemed like this company was invincible and destined to go from strength to strength. It was an unshakable, irreplaceable pillar of the industry. By 2021, however, Evergrande had all but collapsed. Its $300 billion worth of liabilities was no longer viable under the three red lines. The firm's death was drawn out but inevitable. A company that had been one of the strongest in all of China just a few years earlier officially filed for bankruptcy in 2023 and was wound down in 2024. Country Garden was another to suffer enormously under the new policy. It began in 1992 and it followed a similar rise to Evergrande, earning a spot on the Fortune Global 500 and building a vast property portfolio. It had projects across China and beyond in locations like Malaysia and Australia. In 2023, however, Country Garden announced it was unable to fulfill its offshore debt obligations and was consequently deemed in default. It was the next high-profile victim of the property market bloodbath. As a direct result of so many developers being forced out of business, a massive inventory of sold but utterly unfinished apartments was left behind. Millions of citizens found themselves stuck in a dystopian paradox. They were legally obligated to pay monthly mortgages on the properties they had purchased, even though these properties weren't even fit to live in and likely never would be. This in turn led to a historic breakdown of the Chinese social contract. All over China, in cities far and wide, home buyers united and collectively agreed to boycott their mortgages. They refused to hand over another yuan unless construction on their homes was completed. Younger people across China went even further. Seeing the crisis unfolding around them and realizing that their own futures were in the process of being erased, they began the Tangping, or lying flat movement. It involved young generations checking out of the economic machine. They refused to play their part in generating wealth for a system that was quite evidently rigged against them. The state tried to limit the damage, relying on the tried-and-true technique of censorship to hide protest messaging from TV screens and social media. But this is no longer just a localized crisis. The fallout is leaking out of China's borders. Up to now, the story has been restricted to China's borders, only impacting its people and its economy. Western observers could watch on with a certain degree of comfort and confidence, seemingly safe in the knowledge that they would be unaffected by this crisis. It was occurring on the other side of the planet, after all. But viewing the bursting of the Chinese property bubble as some sort of isolated or entirely domestic incident is a dangerous mistake to make. An event of this magnitude has the power to send ripples far beyond its epicenter, far past the country's borders and into other countries and continents. And that's exactly what's happening. The development collapse was just patient zero in a rapidly evolving global contagion, and the fallout is already spreading in two distinct ways. First is the massive wave of capital flight. When those middle-class Chinese citizens started to realize that their domestic assets were rapidly losing value or even being liquidated by the state, they began to panic, and in that fit of panic, they sought to move whatever wealth they had left out of China and into other markets, Western markets to be precise. Reports showed that huge amounts of Chinese capital are being funneled out of Beijing and into international property. Chinese developers and investors are buying up homes in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco in the US, Vancouver and Toronto in Canada, London and Paris in Europe, and even Sydney, Australia. This is the ripple. As all of that money flows into Western property markets, it causes the average prices of remaining properties to rise as a result. That in turn affects local people. The people who have grown up saving as much money as they can, all in the hope of eventually being able to afford their own home and settling down. Now, those same people are being priced right out of the market. They're not doing it intentionally, of course, but those same developers, investors, and middle-class Chinese families are exporting their domestic housing crisis to other countries. The second way in which this crisis is bypassing borders with reckless abandon relates to the ghost city model. It's the idea of massive corporate and state entities effectively owning and operating entire cities, forcing individuals to own nothing but lease everything. That sounds like a dystopian hellscape to most people. Independent analysts are already arguing that China has effectively provided the ideal real-world testing ground for this new economic paradigm. The systematic destruction of middle-class homeownership, thinly veiled under the banner of stabilizing the financial system. Some believe that private property ownership is no longer a dream or aspiration for the working and middle classes. Instead, it's a distant memory. But if homeownership is dead, what replaces it? While it might still take some time for other parts of the world to catch up, China appears to be already well on the way to that post-ownership society. The country's central bank has been forging ahead with the integration of the so-called digital yuan, also known as e-CNY. This is a digital form of ledger tender intended to eventually replace physical cash. It started as a limited pilot program, but it's swiftly expanding into something much greater as the days and weeks of 2026 go by. e-CNY is being implemented into the country's biggest mobile apps and platforms, like WeChat and Alipay. It's also been integrated into the public sector too. In May 2023, Chinese civil servants started receiving their salaries in the form of this digital currency. Soon, citizens will be able to use it to pay for the likes of public transport or at checkouts in retail stores. The property crisis effectively provided the perfect cover for the government to deploy this system. With conventional property-based wealth wiped out, citizens have limited options available to them. Therefore, they're more likely to embrace state-backed digital infrastructure simply to survive. But make no mistake, the digital yuan is not a normal currency, nor is it a neutral one. It is a programmable and fully traceable instrument of social control, and that control lies entirely in the hands of the central government. If it wanted to, the CCP could program some sort of expiration data on funds to force people to go out and spend them. It could freeze the wallets of those who are seen to show any sort of dissident or disobedience. It could automatically enforce fines and penalties based on real-time social credit monitoring. Meanwhile, even those who haven't been directly affected by the crisis in China are starting to ask questions about their finances. People are feeling poorer, spending smaller amounts, and trying to make smarter decisions with the money they have. They're increasingly rejecting the age-old middle-class bargain that revolves around working your way up the ladder and storing much of your money in real estate. Because when property stops appreciating, the very promise of upward mobility no longer feels valid. At the highest levels and behind the scenes of international markets, the smart money is already on the move. Institutional capital is fleeing from paper assets and property markets and moving instead into values that are seen as more stable and sure, like gold and other tangible commodities. Because the financial nuclear winter is no longer a theory or a projection. It's a spot on the horizon, and it's growing bigger by the day. And if individuals can no longer rely on the legacy models of wealth accumulation to safeguard their security and their families' futures, they have to look for other options, and one of those options is being willing to adapt to a world where the very concept of ownership is well and truly under siege. China's real estate collapse is just one part of a bigger problem. Right now, Beijing is staring over the edge of a financial cliff, and there may not be an easy way out. Find out the full story and why China's economy is failing, or watch this.